At the Arizona Aviation Heritage Museum in Mesa, Arizona, a crowd had gathered around a beautifully restored North American T-6 Texan, one of the most iconic military trainer aircraft ever built. The museum was preparing the airplane for its annual Veterans Flight demonstration. But there was one serious problem. For 3 straight days, experienced aircraft mechanics had been unable to start the aircraft's restored Pratt & Whitney radial engine. The starter engaged, fuel pressure looked normal. Ignition systems had been inspected twice. Every checklist had been completed. Yet each attempt ended the same way. The engine coughed, sputtered for a few seconds, and died. Standing quietly behind the crowd was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded Army Air Forces maintenance jacket, an old leather tool pouch hanging from his shoulder, and carrying a polished hickory cane. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't watching the mechanics. He was listening. Every time the engine attempted to start, he closed his eyes for a few seconds before opening them again. A group of young aviation maintenance students noticed him. One smiled. "Grandpa looks like he's diagnosing it with his ears." Another laughed. "Maybe he'll fix it by listening hard enough." A third pointed toward the old mechanic, quietly counting the engine revolutions under his breath. "Careful, sir. This airplane hasn't flown since before you retired." The group laughed together. The elderly man simply smiled and waited until another unsuccessful start attempt ended in silence. Then he slowly walked toward the chief mechanic. "Excuse me," he asked politely. "May I hear it crank one more time?" The mechanics exchanged amused glances. One shrugged. "You're welcome to listen." Another smiled. "If you can hear something the rest of us can't, we'd all like to know." Before anyone could say another word, the museum's chief restoration director, Colonel Richard Hayes, USAF Ret, stepped out of the hangar, saw the elderly visitor, and immediately stopped. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward the old man and rendered a crisp military salute. "Chief Master Sergeant William Bill Carter," he said with unmistakable respect. "I never thought I'd see you standing beside another T-6. Every mechanic froze. Only moments earlier they had assumed the quiet old man was simply another veteran enjoying the museum. None of them realized they were standing beside one of the U.S. Air Force's legendary aircraft maintenance chiefs, a man who had spent nearly 4 decades keeping military aircraft flying, trained generations of engine specialists, and once became famous for diagnosing catastrophic engine failures using nothing more than the sound of a radial engine at idle. Inside the worn leather tool pouch he carried rested a small mechanic's notebook filled with handwritten engine notes dating back more than 50 years, along with one sealed envelope from the squadron commander who had once trusted Bill's ears more than any diagnostic instrument. Before the propeller turned again that afternoon, everyone in the hangar would discover why an experienced mechanic sometimes listens before he touches a single tool, learn the heartbreaking story hidden inside the old notebook, and witness an 80-year-old veteran solve in seconds the engine problem that had defeated modern mechanics for 3 long days. The restoration hangar at the Arizona Aviation Heritage Museum buzzed with activity as mechanics made final preparations for the museum's annual Veterans Flight demonstration. At the center of the hangar stood a beautifully restored North American T-6 Texan, its polished aluminum skin gleaming beneath the lights. Only one problem remained. The aircraft refused to start. For 3 days, experienced mechanics had inspected the fuel system, magnetos, ignition harnesses, spark plugs, oil pressure, and electrical circuits. Every checklist had been completed more than once. Yet each attempt ended exactly the same way. The starter engaged, the propeller spun, the Pratt & Whitney radial engine coughed several times, fired briefly, then fell silent. Around the aircraft stood a group of young aviation maintenance students watching another unsuccessful attempt. Near the back of the crowd, an 80-year-old man wearing a faded Army Air Forces maintenance jacket, carrying a weathered leather tool pouch over one shoulder, and leaning on a polished hickory cane, quietly observed the engine. Unlike everyone else, he never looked beneath the cowling. Every time the propeller began turning, he simply closed his eyes and listened. One student noticed him first. "That gentleman hasn't looked at the engine once." Another laughed. "Maybe he's diagnosing it with magic." A third smiled. "Careful, Grandpa. Airplanes usually need tools, not hearing aids." The group laughed together. The elderly mechanic only smiled politely. When the propeller stopped once again, he slowly walked toward the chief mechanic. "Excuse me," he said calmly. Would you mind cranking it just one more time? The chief mechanic looked surprised. You don't want us to remove the cowling? The old man gently shook his head. Not yet. Another mechanic smiled politely. Sir, we've already spent 3 days checking everything. I believe you, the old man replied. I'd just like to hear it once more. Amused but curious, the chief mechanic nodded. One more attempt? The propeller spun again. The radial engine fired unevenly for only a few seconds before dying exactly as it had every time before. The old man never moved. He simply stood with his eyes closed until the last sound disappeared. Then he opened them and quietly smiled. Interesting. One student folded his arms. You figured it out already? I think so. Without touching the airplane? The old man nodded. Without touching it. Several students exchanged skeptical glances. So what's wrong with it? Before the elderly mechanic could answer, the large hangar doors opened. Colonel Richard Hayes, USAF RET, director of the restoration program, walked inside after hearing that another start attempt had failed. He glanced toward the crowd, then immediately stopped when he saw the old man standing beside the aircraft. Without hesitation, he walked straight across the hangar, came to attention, and rendered a crisp military salute. Chief Master Sergeant William Carter, he said proudly. Welcome back. Every conversation stopped instantly. The students stared in disbelief. William calmly returned the salute. Good afternoon, Colonel. Hayes smiled warmly. You should have told me you were coming. William looked toward the silent T-6. I heard one of my old girls wasn't feeling well. Quiet laughter spread through the hangar. One of the mechanics looked at the colonel in confusion. Sir, you know him? Hayes smiled. Know him? He looked around the room. Every Air Force maintenance chief knows his name. Complete silence settled over the hangar. Hayes rested one hand on the aircraft's engine, cowling. Chief Master Sergeant William Carter spent 39 years keeping military aircraft flying. He pointed toward the radial engine. He trained generations of engine specialists. Then he looked back at William with obvious respect. There are pilots alive today because he heard problems nobody else could. The students who had laughed only moments earlier slowly looked back at the elderly mechanic. William gently rested one hand on the engine, cowling before quietly saying, I hope I'm wrong. He paused for just a moment. But I've heard that sound once before, and it almost cost us an airplane. The restoration hangar became completely silent after William Carter spoke those final words. The mechanics looked at one another, unsure whether to be curious or concerned. Colonel Richard Hayes folded his arms and quietly nodded. You're thinking about Davis Air Base, aren't you? William smiled faintly. I was hoping I was the only one who remembered. Hayes slowly shook his head. No one who was there could ever forget. The young maintenance students exchanged puzzled looks. One finally asked, Sir, what happened? William rested his weathered leather tool pouch on a nearby workbench before answering, 53 years ago, I was a young staff sergeant assigned to an Air Force training squadron. He gently placed one hand on the T-6's polished cowling. One morning, one of our trainers refused to start. He smiled slightly. Everyone thought it was the ignition system. Another student nodded. That's exactly what we've been checking. William looked at him kindly. So did we? The hangar remained completely silent. For almost 2 days, experienced mechanics replaced spark plugs, inspected magnetos, adjusted fuel mixtures, checked compression, and even swapped electrical components from another aircraft. He paused for a moment. Nothing worked. Then what happened? Someone asked quietly. William closed his eyes as if hearing the old engine once again. An old chief walked into the hangar. Several students smiled, realizing the similarity. He didn't open the engine. William shook his head. He asked us to crank it once. Just once? Just once. William smiled. He listened for less than 5 seconds. And? William looked toward the silent propeller. He said, the engine is trying to breathe, but something keeps interrupting its rhythm. One mechanic frowned. What did he mean? William pointed toward the air intake beneath the cowling. Everyone had been looking at fuel. Then he pointed toward the ignition system, or spark. Finally, he gently tapped the intake housing. Nobody checked whether the engine was getting clean. Uninterrupted airflow. The chief mechanic looked thoughtful. The intake? William nodded. A small piece of protective packing material had accidentally been left inside during maintenance. Several mechanics stared at the engine in surprise. It wasn't blocking the airflow completely, William explained, only enough to create an uneven breathing pattern. Colonel Hayes smiled. The old chief heard it immediately. William nodded. Because he wasn't listening for what was loud. He looked around the hangar. He was listening for what was missing. Complete silence settled over the room. One of the younger mechanics quietly asked, "Is that what you're hearing today?" William smiled gently. Almost. He slowly walked toward the nose of the aircraft and rested one hand beneath the engine, cowling. This engine isn't missing fuel. It isn't missing spark. It isn't even missing compression. The chief mechanic stepped closer. Then what's wrong? William pointed toward the front of the radial engine. Listen carefully. He looked around the room. When the engine fired, "Soulinar puis soulinar." Did you notice something? No one answered. William smiled. Exactly. He looked toward Colonel Hayes. Would you mind removing only the upper front inspection panel? The chief mechanic looked surprised. Only that one? Nothing else. Curious now. The mechanics quickly removed the small inspection cover without opening the entire engine. William leaned forward, looked inside for only a few seconds, and quietly nodded. I thought so. What did you find? One student asked eagerly. William pointed toward a small linkage hidden behind the engine's intake assembly. There's nothing broken. He smiled. Something is simply one adjustment away from working perfectly. Every mechanic in the hangar leaned closer as William carefully reached into his old leather tool pouch and removed the same small flat-blade screwdriver he had carried for more than half a century. The hangar remained completely silent as Chief Master Sergeant William Carter held the small flat-blade screwdriver in his hand. It was old, its wooden handle worn smooth after decades of use. One of the younger mechanics smiled nervously. Is that really the tool you're going to use? William chuckled softly. It's the same one I've carried since 1971. Colonel Richard Hayes laughed. I've seen that screwdriver solve more problems than entire toolboxes. William carefully reached through the small inspection opening beneath the engine. Cowling, he never removed another panel. He never disconnected a single fuel line. Instead, he gently touched a small linkage connected to the carburetor control assembly. There you are, he whispered almost to himself. The chief mechanic leaned closer. What's wrong? William smiled. Nothing is broken. He pointed toward the linkage. During the restoration, this adjustment was set almost perfectly. One student looked confused. Almost? William nodded. Almost is sometimes the longest distance between an engine that runs and one that doesn't. He carefully loosened a small locking nut, rotated the adjustment less than a quarter of a turn, and tightened it again. The movement lasted no more than 10 seconds. Then he stepped away. That's it? Someone asked. William slipped the screwdriver back into his leather pouch. That's it. Several students exchanged doubtful looks. One quietly whispered, "There's no way." William looked toward the chief mechanic. Whenever you're ready. The mechanic climbed into the cockpit and engaged the starter. The propeller began turning. One blade. 2, 3. Then, with a deep burst of smoke, the Pratt & Whitney radial engine came alive. Instead of coughing and dying, it settled into a smooth, steady rumble that echoed throughout the hangar. The entire building fell silent for one heartbeat before applause erupted from every direction. Some of the younger mechanics simply stared at the running engine in disbelief. The chief mechanic quickly checked the gauges. Oil pressure normal. Cylinder temperatures stable. RPM steady. He looked down from the cockpit with astonishment. It's perfect. William quietly smiled as he listened to the engine idle. Now it sounds like itself again. Colonel Hayes walked over beside him. How did you know? William never took his eyes off the aircraft. Because engines have rhythm. He gently tapped one finger against his ear. Most people listen for noises. He smiled. Old mechanics listened for silence. The room became quiet again. William continued. Every cylinder should contribute equally. He pointed toward the engine. When one tiny adjustment changes that rhythm, the engine starts telling you long before it stops running. One student shook his head in amazement. You heard all of that in just a few seconds? William nodded. After enough years, he smiled warmly. The engine becomes an old friend. The chief mechanic climbed down from the cockpit and walked straight toward William. Without saying a word, he extended his hand. William shook it. Thank you. William smiled gently. Don't thank me. He looked toward the aircraft. Thank the engine. Several students laughed softly. One asked, The engine? William nodded. It was trying to explain the problem the whole time. He paused before adding, We just forgot how to listen. Colonel Hayes looked toward the old leather tool pouch resting beside William. Partially visible inside was a faded mechanic's notebook. with hundreds of handwritten engine notes collected over nearly 4 decades. Tucked between its final pages rested a sealed envelope that had never been opened. Hayes quietly recognized the handwriting immediately. "You still carry Captain Mitchell's letter." William gently rested one hand on the notebook. "Every day." Hayes lowered his voice. "You promised him?" William nodded once. "He told me not to open it until I met a generation of mechanics who trusted their ears as much as their instruments." The smile slowly returned to Hayes's face. "I think today might finally be that day." The radial engine continued running with a deep, steady rhythm that filled the restoration hangar. For the first time in 3 days, no one rushed toward the aircraft. No one searched for another fault. The sound alone told every experienced mechanic that the engine was finally healthy. Chief Master Sergeant William Carter stood quietly beside the spinning propeller, listening for several more seconds before giving a small nod. "Now she's happy," he said softly. The chief mechanic smiled. "I've never heard an engine change that much from such a tiny adjustment." William looked toward him. "Small mistakes create big problems." He paused. "Small corrections create big recoveries." Colonel Richard Hayes stepped closer, holding William's weathered leather notebook. "Bill," he said quietly, "I think it's finally time." William looked down at the notebook for a long moment, before slowly opening it. Tucked between the last 2 pages rested a yellowed envelope whose edges had become soft with age. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were only a few words. "For Bill. Open only after you find mechanics who are willing to listen before they reach for their tools." Every person inside the hangar became silent. William carefully broke the old seal. "Captain Thomas Mitchell gave me this letter the day he retired," he said. "He made me promise I wouldn't read it until I knew another generation was ready." He unfolded the paper and began reading aloud. "If you're holding this letter, then you've finally met mechanics who understand that airplanes are never repaired by tools alone." He looked up briefly before continuing. "The finest wrench in the world is useless in impatient hands. The smartest diagnostic equipment is useless if no one understands what the engine is trying to say." The students listened without moving. William continued reading. "Never let technology replace curiosity. Never let confidence replace careful observation. Before you remove a single bolt, spend 1 more minute listening, watching, and thinking. Most engines whisper their problems long before they fail." Colonel Hayes quietly lowered his eyes. William smiled gently as he reached the final paragraph. "One day you'll become the oldest mechanic in the hangar. When that day comes, remember that your greatest responsibility will no longer be repairing airplanes. It will be teaching someone else how to hear what you once heard." William slowly lowered the letter. The hangar remained completely silent. Several of the younger mechanics looked back toward the running T6 with entirely different eyes. They were no longer hearing only an engine. They were hearing a conversation they had never learned to recognize before. Colonel Hayes stepped beside William and faced the group. "Today," he said proudly, "Chief Master Sergeant Carter didn't fix an airplane." He smiled. "He repaired the way we think about maintenance." The chief mechanic nodded in agreement. "For 3 days, we trusted our instruments." He looked toward William. "You trusted the airplane." William laughed softly. "No." He gently rested one hand on the engine, cowling. "I trusted 40 years of listening." The steady rumble of the radial engine echoed through the hangar as every mechanic stood quietly, realizing they had just witnessed a lesson that no maintenance manual could ever fully teach. The applause slowly faded, but no one in the restoration hangar seemed eager to leave. The steady rhythm of the T6's radial engine continued echoing through the building, and for many of the younger mechanics, it no longer sounded like an ordinary aircraft engine. It sounded like a language they had only just begun to understand. Chief Master Sergeant William Carter waited until the engine was shut down before walking slowly toward the aircraft one final time. He rested his hand against the polished aluminum cowling and smiled gently. "She'll fly beautifully tomorrow." The chief mechanic nodded. "Because of you." William quietly shook his head. "Because everyone here was willing to keep learning." Colonel Richard Hayes stepped forward carrying William's weathered mechanic's notebook and Captain Thomas Mitchell's letter. "Bill," he said, "I'd like your permission to keep these here." William smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." Hayes looked surprised. "You were?" William nodded. "They've been with me long enough." He looked around the hangar at the young mechanics. "Now they belong to the people who'll keep airplanes flying after I'm gone." Complete silence settled over the room. Hayes carefully opened the notebook. Every page contained handwritten engine notes, sketches of carburetor linkages, ignition timing diagrams, maintenance observations, and dozens of small reminders collected over nearly 4 decades. Some pages were stained with oil. Others carried dates from aircraft long since retired. Tucked into the inside cover was one final page, written entirely in William's own handwriting. Across the top were 3 simple principles. Listen before you loosen. Observe before you replace. Every careful repair helps someone come home safely. The chief mechanic quietly read the words aloud. No one spoke afterward. Hayes turned toward the maintenance students gathered around the aircraft. Beginning today, he announced, every apprentice mechanic who trains in this hangar will begin with these 3 principles before touching a single aircraft. A quiet murmur of approval spread throughout the building. Hayes then nodded toward the museum entrance, where a polished glass display case stood beneath a dark blue cover. Together, he and William walked toward it. Hayes slowly removed the cloth. Inside rested William's leather tool pouch, the old flat-blade screwdriver, Captain Mitchell's letter, the weathered mechanic's notebook, and the original maintenance log describing the engine problem that had defeated the restoration team for 3 days. At the center of the display stood a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Carter Mitchell Aviation Maintenance Legacy," dedicated to Chief Master Sergeant William Carter and Captain Thomas Mitchell, whose patience, craftsmanship, and devotion to excellence continue protecting every pilot who trusts an aircraft to bring them home. The best mechanics repair machines. The greatest mechanics teach others how to listen. William stood silently for several moments before smiling. Tom would have said the display case was too clean. Gentle laughter filled the hangar. Hayes smiled. Then we'll make sure the students leave fingerprints on the lessons instead. William nodded approvingly. Years later, after Chief Master Sergeant William Carter passed away peacefully at the age of 90, every new apprentice mechanic entering the Arizona Aviation Heritage Museum began training not beside an airplane, but in front of that display. Before learning about engines, magnetos, carburetors, or propellers, they first learned the story of an elderly mechanic who arrived as an ordinary visitor, listened to an engine for only a few seconds, and solved a problem that modern diagnostics had failed to find for 3 days. Beside the display, one final bronze inscription greeted every future mechanic. An engine will usually tell you what's wrong. The question is whether you've learned to listen before reaching for your tools. Most visitors believed they were looking at an old toolbox and a faded notebook preserved for history. Those who knew the full story understood they were looking at something far more valuable. A lifetime of experience. A promise kept across generations, and the timeless reminder that the greatest craftsmen are remembered not for the machines they repaired, but for the people they taught to hear what others could not. An airplane is often admired for its speed, its graceful wings, or the powerful engine that carries it into the sky. Yet every experienced mechanic knows that an aircraft does not stay in the air because of horsepower alone. It flies because countless small details work together exactly as they should. Sometimes, the difference between a safe landing and a terrible accident is nothing more than a tiny adjustment that someone cared enough to notice. Chief Master Sergeant William Carter understood that truth. After spending nearly 4 decades listening to airplanes more carefully than most people ever could, he knew that machines rarely fail without warning. More often, they whisper long before they break. The real challenge is finding someone patient enough to hear those whispers. Captain Thomas Mitchell left behind a lesson that extends far beyond aviation. He believed that every new tool, every modern instrument, and every technological breakthrough should make mechanics more capable, but never less curious. Technology is an extraordinary partner, but it should never replace careful observation, thoughtful judgment, or the willingness to ask one more question before assuming we already know the answer. The young mechanics made the same mistake many of us make every day. They believed that solving a problem meant immediately reaching for more equipment, more measurements, and more complicated explanations. William showed them something entirely different. Sometimes the greatest breakthrough comes not from doing more, but from slowing down long enough to understand what is already happening. Before turning another wrench, before replacing another part, before blaming another system, take a moment to listen. That lesson applies just as much to people as it does to engines. Families, friendships, workplaces, and communities often reveal small signs of trouble long before serious problems appear. The people who truly care are the ones who notice those quiet changes while there is still time to help. William often said that every engine has its own voice. Experienced mechanics do not simply hear noise. They hear rhythm, balance, hesitation, confidence, and warning. In many ways, life works the same way. Success rarely belongs to the loudest person in the room. It often belongs to the one who notices what everyone else is too busy to hear. Perhaps the most unforgettable moment in this story was not when the old T6 finally roared back to life, nor when the entire hangar applauded the elderly mechanic who solved in seconds what others had struggled with for days. It was the quiet moment when William Carter opened Captain Mitchell's letter and reminded a new generation that the greatest responsibility of a master craftsman is not simply fixing machines, it is teaching someone else how to think, how to observe, and how to listen with patience. That is how true legacies are built. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever known a veteran, mechanic, engineer, teacher, mentor, parent, or friend whose quiet experience helped solve a problem no one else could understand? We'd be honored to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, leadership, craftsmanship, honor, wisdom, friendship, perseverance, sacrifice, and the extraordinary people whose greatest achievements were not the machines they repaired, but the lives they quietly protected. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every pilot flying far from home, protect every mechanic whose careful work keeps others safe, strengthen every mentor willing to pass on hard-earned knowledge, comfort every family remembering someone who devoted a lifetime to serving others, and remind all of us that true mastery is never measured by how quickly we solve a problem. It is measured by how patiently we learn to understand it first. And may you never forget that sometimes the most important sound you will ever hear is the quiet whisper. Everyone else was too busy to notice.